Welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. We are a monthly gathering of atheists and Christians. We get together to discuss important books from both perspectives. We usually alternate. We do a Christian book one month, atheist book the next. Usually we have the author of the book with us to give some insight, take our questions. My name is James Walker. I'm a Christian, co-founder of the club. I'm a Christian apologist, president of Watchman Fellowship, an evangelical apologetics ministry focusing primarily on new religious movements, alternative faiths, and evangelism, interfaith evangelism. Our other co-founder you'll meet in a minute is Bill Cluck. He's a former Christian, now atheist. We are going to be talking today with David Fitzgerald, our guest author. Welcome, David. He's a writer, public speaker, historical researcher out of San Francisco. He's, in addition to serving on the board of San Francisco Atheists, he's also been the director, co-founder of both the world's first atheist film festival and Evolution Palooza, which is San Francisco's oldest annual Darwin Day celebration. In addition, he's the author and historical researcher who is actively investigating the historical Jesus question for over 18 years. He has a degree in history. He was associate member of CSER, the former Committee for the Scientific Examination of Religion. He lectures around the world at universities, churches, national secular events, and also speaks to religious groups. But today he's talking to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. And our topic, and we've dealt with this several times in the club. In fact, David's been our guest author kind of at, I think, the first couple of months of our book club. He was our guest author. We looked at his book, Nailed. Today, we're going to be addressing the question again, did Jesus even exist? And we're going to be talking about his book, Jesus, Mything in Action. David, welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club.
Thank you guys for having me so much. I really need to update that biography because we actually moved from San Francisco 3 years ago. And
where are you now?
Study. Now I'm up in Eureka, up in Bigfoot country, about 5 hours north of where I was. But we were in San Francisco
close to Oregon, right?
Sorry?
Getting close to Oregon?
Getting close there. About
North California? Yeah. Okay, yes.
Yeah. Does Bigfoot exist?
You know, that's a good question. There are many who say.
More likely than Jesus, I'm guessing.
It was Daniel, I think I was talking to, saying that between John the Baptist and Jesus, I'm sort of, if I had to put money on it, I would put more money on John the Baptist than Jesus. But it wouldn't shock me if they both turned out to be.
Now, one thing we're going to talk about later is I think you have to be very careful of adding anything historical if you're a mythicist, because it's kind of like if you're going to talk about Chronicles of Narnia is mythology. There's no such thing as Narnia. There's no such thing as this and that. But the talking lion, that part's historical. But everything else, once you get anything, even Paul or anything you start saying historical, I think it's a slippery slope for the mythicism position. But we'll talk about that in a minute. Let me introduce our other co-founder, Bill Cluck. Before I go to Bill, just kind of the format of what we're going to do. David is our guest author. He's going to be here to talk about his book, to take our questions. We want to remember that this is a respectful conversation. I'm very proud of the whole club. You guys just do an excellent job of coming in, and whether you're a Christian or atheist, you're respecting our authors. I appreciate that. We want to make sure that in the comments we keep it friendly as well, and we don't want to shy away from tough questions. We want hard questions. David wants tough questions, but we want to be respectful of our authors. And so far in the club, we've had one real bad club meeting many years ago, but we've had a great ever since, and we want to keep it that way. If you're new, just know we may be on opposite sides of the issue, but we like each other and we're friends, and we want to keep it that way. So, and this is why, David, I don't know if you remember when we did Nail, this was in the early days, we did a Skype I did a Skype conversation with you ahead of time. And it's just great now that we can have you here live so that we can live ask the question, have a little feedback. And the way it works is Brady Blevins and Daniel Ray are on our staff, and they're going to be taking your questions. If you have a question and you want to get in on that, please put it in the comments. And at some point, either Brady or Daniel will say, please unmute. You've got the mic and you can ask a question. Now, if you don't want to be on camera, some people want to have a question, but they don't want to come on. That's fine. You can say, Daniel, could you ask this question for me? And we can do it that way as well. So let me throw it out to Bill. We're going to let Bill is a privilege of being the co-founder of our book club. He's going to ask the first question or two of David. So Bill is a former atheist, former Christian, now atheist, hopefully former atheist pretty soon, but former Christian, now atheist. And he's not a mythicist, but he is an atheist. Bill, do you have a question or comment for David?
Well, first of all, we're going to have a contest who has the best looking cat. So here's Sabrina. Hey.
Let's see. Where's
And
Khaleesi?
David's a cat person, so he's going to show his cat. We'll have a cat off.
Yeah, I have a cat off. Well, if we're
Okay.
lucky,
So I
10
love David's book, Mything in Action. One thing great about David is he makes it this scholarship readable and understandable to the layperson. He makes it fun. Like one time in the book, he said, or in one of your videos, you said more nails. He was talking about the Gospel of John, how he's like, so, big time. And in the book on page 163, he talks about Jesus pulling off the trifecta. The woman in Samaria or whatever that says, Jesus, could you heal my daughter? And he goes, I shouldn't give the children's pearls cast to the dogs. And she goes, even the dogs get the crumbs. He goes, I'm going to give you a miracle. So we, as Christians, we were so caught up in the spiritual thing that we don't see the real Jesus, who was kind of a jerk, sexist and racist, as David pointed out. But I just wish all scholars could make it so understandable and so fun. Right, David?
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I feel like that's really the only thing I bring to the table is making the work of scholars accessible.
Well, you do an excellent job, and we'll get into it in a minute. But here's one of my questions:
Sure.
Are you familiar with Dale Allison?
Yes.
Okay, great. He's the atheist. Best atheists have a love affair with Dale Allison because he's very honest. He says Jesus was wrong about the second coming. I said, well, Dale, how about the birth narratives? Oh, I don't see a lot of history in that. How about the post-resurrection, like the Sea of Tiberias, the fish fry at the Sea of Tiberias? Yeah. And he's like, no, that didn't happen. So I just love the guy. Yeah. But here's the thing. Dale Allison and Barton, two of the top scholars in the world, say that the best way to understand Jesus is an apocalyptic prophet who had a bad weekend in Jerusalem. It's multiply attested. It's in MLQ, our Q source, and here's Bart's book. Right. And he goes and says, this is where Q's talking. This is where M, not Matthew, is talking. So with this multiple attestation and these two top-notch scholars who firmly believe in Jesus, shouldn't you not lean on your own understanding, but trust in the scholarship of Bart and Dale?
Well, it's funny you bring up Bart, especially because I'm a huge Bart Ehrman fan. I've read just about every single book he's written and love every single book he's written, with few exceptions. One thing he points out is that all the secular reconstructions of Jesus fail to account for why the Romans would kill him. And he also admits that, admittedly, his own idea that Jesus was just a failed apocalyptic prophet also doesn't meet that criteria, doesn't answer why. And our Gospels don't really answer why, because it wasn't blasphemous to declare yourself the Messiah. Lots of Jews declared themselves the Messiah. And if it had been blasphemy, if there was something else he did that was blasphemous, they would have stoned him to death.
Is there a rock shortage in Jerusalem?
And in fact, when we look at the way that Mark portrays the trial of Jesus, Jewish scholars forever have been saying, okay, that didn't happen, that couldn't happen, that couldn't happen. And it's like, well, Yeah, they just dogpile on each other so fast. And yet, when we look at what the gospel has to say, and I'm talking about Mark's gospel, the original gospel,
Right.
for starters.
No frills, yeah. Unvarnished.
Everything about it, everything from start to finish is an allegory. It's midrashic, it's pesher, it's a taking Hebrew scriptures and bringing them to life in a way that we don't see in Christianity before the Gospels are written.
But how
Before
about-
Mark's Gospels is written, Paul never talks like that. No one else in that generation talks like that. The author of the book of Hebrews doesn't talk like that. It's
But how
only
about Mark
after the Gospel.
6, where, sure, we're going to throw away, like you said, the supernatural stuff, Jesus walking
Right.
on water and all
Right.
that. But the mundane stuff, like remember in Mark 6, where Jesus goes, and he couldn't perform any big miracles because of the unbelief. And his family saying, hey, get this guy out of here. Isn't that because it's mundane and because of the criteria of embarrassment? Doesn't that seem historical?
I talk about that in the book, actually. For Mark, it wasn't embarrassment to have a fallible human Jesus because his Jesus was human. He wasn't the Son of God right from the start. He made the Son of God until he was adopted by God at his baptism. And he wasn't exalted to Lord until he went all the way through the Garden of Gethsemane, all the way to the crucifixion, the death, and was resurrected by God. That's when he became Lord, according to Mark. Now, it definitely embarrassed the other gospel writers because Matthew changed that. Luke
Right.
changed
He said, I'm not worthy
Yeah.
to untie his shoes.
Right.
And on page 134, you list, which is what's good about this book, is you address the criticisms
Yeah.
of the scholars. But the criteria of embarrassment is so strong. Like you mentioned, Jesus being baptized by John would be embarrassing and he should be baptized. And as you said, Matthew corrects it and
Yeah.
says, I'm not
Yeah.
baptized. Doesn't that fact that Matthew feels he has to correct it rather than just make up a whole new story, doesn't that seem to indicate historicity?
For me, it just indicates that it's based on Mark, which is known. Even if Christianity is true, even if Jesus was real, everything we know about him still comes from Mark. All our biographical information, quote unquote,
But wait a minute,
comes
how
from that
about
first.
Paul, who says there was a Last Supper, that he had disciples, that
Well, actually, no. Paul never says he has disciples. He never uses the word disciples ever in any
he refers to
context
the 12. He appeared
whatsoever.
to-
Sorry?
He appeared to Peter, the women, and the 12.
Right. But when you ask Paul who Peter was, who James was, in Galatians, these are the leaders of the Jerusalem church, and he doesn't like them. He doesn't even think they're real Christians.
Absolutely.
This is the guy that supposedly is supposed to be the brother of the Lord, and yet he says, "Oh yeah, I didn't give in to them for a second. I opposed them face to face, and they brought in false believers to steal our Christianity." It's very weird to hear the way he talks about these leaders of the Jerusalem church that we think of as Jesus' friends and family. Yeah, it's very bizarre.
But what I'm saying, it seems so realistic, so believable that you have Paul and the outsider and James and Peter, hey, God, we were with Jesus. You would expect this conflict. And
Well,
in
you would
Galatians,
expect-
you have a big
You would
conflict.
expect them to
and
mention
Acts tries to
something
smooth
about
out.
it. You'd
I'm sorry,
expect
go ahead.
Paul to show some awareness of it. Paul never says anything like, "Oh, they were Jesus' disciples, but here's why they're wrong. Here's why you should need to listen to me." He never says anything remotely like that. He never says anything remotely like, "Oh, and Jesus appeared to me on the road to Damascus, and I was paralyzed for 3 days and blinded and thrown off my horse." All that. We don't get that from him ever. Nothing remotely like that. Luke gives us 3 incompatible versions of it. He never says anything remotely like that. And
Yeah.
Paul likes to talk about his own qualification. He likes to talk about how he suffered for the Lord and all that.
Right. It just seems that you have this early movement that's just trying to figure itself out. Remember, it says these are
For
the
sure.
5 things we're going to say to people: don't have sexual immorality, don't,
And that's true. There was definitely a split in early Christianity between the Jerusalem church and Pauline Christianity. And there were others. He talks about all these other, the Apollonius of Alexandria, and some are of Cephas, some are of Christ, some are of Paul, some are of Apollo. There's all these different factions going on that we see. But they're preaching different gospels and different Christs from him,
which makes sense, because like in Mormonism, it's all on the same page, where it's variegated here in the Gospels and Acts and so forth. But also things like the criteria of dissimilarity, where if it sounds like it came from a Christian, it probably isn't historical. For example, Jesus said, "This is I was hungry and you fed me. I was in prison and you visited me." Works-based religion. Now, we inherited Pauline Christianity, which is believe in Jesus, grace plus nothing. So if Christians were making it up, if this was being made up, they would have said something about believing in Jesus. So it passes the criteria of dissimilarity, and some of these passes the criteria of multiple attestation as well.
Well, when it gets especially dodgy when you start talking about multiple attestations for things that maybe they're not multiply attested to. Maybe they're all dependent on one thing. And like, for instance, when you're talking about M and Q and L, I don't think there was a Q full stop. I think that's just the parts of Luke where he's taking from Matthew and from Mark. We don't have these hypothetical sources, and we don't know what they would have said if they existed. So it's like, depending on them for what they said, it's like, we don't even know if they exist in the first place. How do you know they're even saying what you want?
Well, because we have Matthew and Luke that have these references to this document Q, which they had to come from somewhere, whether you call it Q or oral sayings.
There are no references to a document. There's nothing. There's no references to a document.
Right. But there are references that are not found in Mark. But
exactly. That's because they start with Mark and they said, I like this, but we can do better. Matthew says, I like this, but we need to fix these mistakes here and add a nativity scene. And Luke says, oh yeah, I like this, but that nativity scene's no good. Let's make this nativity scene, and tells a completely different nativity story than Matthew does, incompatible with his at every point. And we can extend those examples all through the gospel. And John doesn't even try to line up with the other gospels. He's like, things that happen in the other gospels at the end of Jesus's career, he has them right in the first week of his career. And then
exactly, John has them at the cleansing the temple at the beginning of his ministry, where the synoptics have it at the end. So if you were trying to get on the same, trying to collude, wouldn't you have it be on the same page?
Yeah. And again, these are just the four gospels that made the cut. We're lucky we had Mark at all, because Matthew and Luke were both trying to make their own version. John is so out there that if it wasn't so popular, it never would have made the cut and been canonized. But the Gospel of Peter, for instance, which has never showed up in our Bibles, but was much more popular than the Gospel of Mark, we're lucky we don't have a giant Jesus and a talking cross in our Gospel of Peter in our Bibles.
So the outside references, like the Josephus quote, obviously the Testimonium Flavianum, where Jesus was a wise person, that's doctored at the very least, but it might have a core to it. And the other one, right?
It might, but I don't think it does, for many reasons. But for me, one of the most important reasons is that for 300 years after Josephus wrote this book, nobody knows about this Testimonium Flavianum, where he says that it's a commercial for Jesus, basically, in this book. And yet one guy, Eusebius, this bishop who was under Constantine and is known for other dodgy literary accomplishments, suddenly he shows up and is multiply attested in Eusebius. And then for another 200 years, till Jerome, no other Christian knows about it until then. So for half a millennia, he's the only guy that knows about this. And it's not because Christians ignored Josephus. Origen loved Josephus, and he complained that Josephus mentions John the Baptist but doesn't mention Jesus, and was mad about that. And what's crazy about that is Origen's copy of Josephus is what Eusebius inherited 2 generations down. So it's like the guy who complained about Josephus not talking about Jesus is the same. It's the same book that suddenly this guy Eusebius finds. Oh, here's this wonderful little patch right here that's a commercial for Jesus that no one's noticed before, and
But
and again,
even the guy
that's just that. But there's other reasons. I spent a whole chapter talking about those.
But even Cunningham with the Skeptic Society or whatever, he says that second quote where the important people like Ananias, the high priest, is coming to Jerusalem, and James, the brother of Jesus, is stoned. So that just sounds like an afterthought. He's talking about the important person, not, he doesn't seem to have an agenda here.
Well, here's the thing, though. That whole story, the second so-called reference to James, makes no sense if it's about anybody who was associated with the early Christian movement in Jerusalem. It makes perfect sense if it's about James, son of Damnius, Jesus, son of Damnius, who the story is about and who it mentions by name. But that's clear. That clearly line fragment there is either a scribal error or as somebody thinking, oh, we need to point this out, And it's weird that it wouldn't be like Josephus just to say that and not explain who this Christ person was.
And Tacitus, who's no friend of Christians, he says the movement began in Judea and then spread to Rome, where all the nutcase things started.
The funny thing about that, and I'm glad you brought up Tacitus because Daniel brought that up too, and I wanted to respond to that. That passage in Tacitus is probably nothing that he wrote. We have it. It probably was originally about Jews, and he turned it into whatever scribe turned it into what we have today. It makes it read like it is today. And the reason I say that is because even when second century Christians were complaining about persecution of Christians, even when they were complaining about Nero's persecution of Christians, they never mentioned that story. And there's other problems with it as well. But yeah, that's why scholars think that that's just the whole thing is a forgery.
Well, and here's the other thing. You have people like Celsius who, he wrote against heresies, or someone that wrote against Celsius.
Contra Celsus, yeah.
Celsus.
Yeah.
And the thing is, Celsus says, oh, the Christians are ignorant and lower class,
right,
and the Virgin Mary probably didn't have him. But he never says Jesus didn't exist, as does
the thing,
any of his opponents.
And that's a fair point, but it's like, why would he think Jesus didn't exist? This is somebody who lived 200 years after the fact. And you could even say Tacitus, even if that passage was true, even if Josephus's passage was true, Bart Ehrman makes a point that these guys are writing, hundreds of years afterwards, at least generations afterwards. Josephus is the closest, and he's writing in the 90s, 93 or 94 of the first century. And everything that these guys all say is what they could have heard from
anybody on the street. Yeah.
And it's like, it doesn't add, Bart Ehrman says it doesn't add anything to the discussion really. And I agree, but there's still reason for doubt on top of all that. And
it just seems to me
same thing with Pliny. We could
sure.
talk about it both sources.
You have the top scholars, like I just said about Dale and Bart, but you also have John Dominic Crossan, who believes Jesus is best viewed as a cynic, social reformer type. But what he says is there's two things which are historically certain: that Jesus was baptized by John and that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate. That's John Dominic friggin' Crossan.
Well, and I respectfully disagree. I respectfully disagree, yeah.
But there's evidence like it says King of the Jews on the epitaph. If a Christian was making this up, they would say Lord, Son of God, something like that, right?
What makes you say that, though? Why would you say that?
Dale Allison said it. I'm just quoting him.
Because whenever I hear somebody saying, oh, well, they couldn't have done that, it's like, couldn't they? This is supposed to be a Jewish religion. This is supposed to be, anytime I see anyone saying, well, no, they should have done this instead of done that, you need to provide some reasons for that. And I hope that I do that when I make those kind of calls in my book.
The other thing, now Josephus talks about John the Baptist, correct?
There's one mention in a passage that seems to be talking about John the Baptist, and that's what I say. If that's legitimate, and there's some questionable things about it, because what it says about John the Baptist sounds like it's a Christian talking about John the Baptist, because it's like, why would a Jew care about what all this nonsense is?
And it's different than the Gospels account of John the
No,
Baptist.
it's not super different.
Super different, okay.
I mean, it's a very small, and it just says that John got executed or put in the prison,
Right.
and Herod executed him. There's very little more than that.
But I'm just saying, if we can get close to a historical John the Baptist, can't we get close to a historical Jesus?
Well, if we had the same kind of information for them and the same what am I trying to say? If there's a there, maybe we can. But it feels like the more we look, the more we see him fading away, and the more everything we know about him turns out to be questionable.
I mean, I can sympathize with you to an extent, because we've had 4 quests for the historical Jesus,
at least,
and they've all
yes.
been total
Yes.
failures.
And I'm glad you brought that up. Have you read Jesus criteria, or let's see, Jesus Authenticity and the Demise of Criteria?
No.
I'm sure I'm getting that name wrong, the title wrong, but that's 2 Christian authors talking about how, for the last 80 years, all our attempts to establish criteria for Jesus have failed. And it's such an honest, refreshing read, especially coming from the Christian side, to hear them say that. Richard Carrier's book, Proving History, also talks a lot about the different criterias and how they fail. And it's not just him saying that how everyone who studied them has agreed that they failed on both sides of the Christian atheist divide.
To me, it's like looking through a stained glass window. And because of the Christian interpretation we're looking through, we're never going to get back to the real Jesus.
Well, see, and this is the thing. It's like everything we think we know about Jesus, true or false, whether he was real or not, it all comes from these myths about him that are in the Gospels. And so I like what Robert Price says. He puts it, if there was a Jesus, there isn't one anymore, because everything we think we know about him comes from these myths that have nothing to do with someone who is really real. We don't have his writings. We don't really have anything from anyone who could claim to have known him. We have forgeries in the names of all those guys, but when it comes down to it, we just do not have information for him. So the book I'm writing right now, I'm talking about, among other things, whether Paul was a real person or not. And
well, you certainly believe Paul existed.
And I do. I mean, he's kind of half real, because half of what we think we know about him is clearly made up from Luke and has nothing to do with Paul.
Yeah,
it's
but
contradicted
I
by
think
Paul.
seeing Paul as a repressed homosexual who's tightly wound, who, high-strung sort of person
Don't
that
get
has
me
to go
started.
one way or the other all the way. He just
Don't get me started. Yeah, I
100%
agree. 100% agree. And that's the thing, is like, there's ways we can get to the historical Paul, even with the forgeries in his name, even with all the questions and dodgeable things about his reworked letters and reacted letters. There's a Paul still there to be found. John the Baptist, I'm not so sure. Maybe. Jesus, I don't see it. And lest we talk about Christianity, same thing goes with every other major world religion on the planet, including Muhammad, including Buddha, and all of them.
But again, Paul in Galatians 1:18-20, he says it with no agenda, kind of matter-of-factly off the cuff. Hey, I went down and saw James or Peter, his close disciple, and James's brother. There doesn't seem to be an agenda there.
But look what he says. He calls James the brother of the Lord. And he also says, I didn't see any apostles. I only saw James, the brother of the Lord. The Greek in that is a little ambiguous. It can mean, I didn't see any apostles. I only saw this guy here, implying that James not an apostle. There's other dodgy things about that too. In fact, that he never says Jesus' brother. And again, just one chapter later, he certainly doesn't act like this is Jesus' brother. And when he talks about the members of the early church and who's in the early church, when he talks about the hierarchy of believers, Jesus' disciples aren't in the picture. Jesus' friends and family aren't in the picture. Those categories don't seem to exist to him when he's talking about who is in the church. And again, it's not just him, it's all the other writers of his generation.
Well, it is troublesome that Paul doesn't seem to know about Jesus' miracles, the empty tomb. I mean,
well, and in fact, what he says is, he implies that there were none to be had, because he says, the Jews look for miracle, the Greeks look for wisdom, and the Jews look for miracles.
We probably need to get in and get a couple more questions in on that, but I would just say on that, David, that Paul regularly talks about the resurrection that even I think mythicists would agree was somewhat of a miracle.
Well, it was definitely a myth. It was definitely a myth. Yeah.
Well, but it was a miracle, not that it happened, but Paul talked about, he said, Paul knows nothing about the miracles of Jesus. Well, the resurrection, he talks about constantly,
Oh, sure.
so,
but it's interesting that's the only one he has.
That's maybe the most important one.
It boils down to that's all he knows about Jesus. Anyway.
So let me ask you on that, David. So did Christianity exist before Paul? Did people believe there was a Jesus? Okay, so.
Oh, wait, so I'm sorry. Say this first part. I think I said yes to the first, not the second.
No,
sorry.
People did believe there was a Jesus before Paul gets on the scene.
Jesus they believed in took different forms. It
Great.
seems like Archangel was one. I'm convinced by the scholars who say that it started as a Jewish version of the mystery faiths. I think he started as a mystery faith deity, and I think Paul shows that really well, and other of the epistles do as well. Okay,
so Paul didn't create the belief in Jesus.
No, I don't think
so. There were people. There was already. When would you date the crucifixion supposedly happened? What date would you give it?
I don't even know if Paul thought the crucifixion happened on earth, or if it did happen, it was something that was done in secret so that the archons wouldn't know about it, the angels of the air, the prince of the air, and Satan and his minions wouldn't know about it. If he thought his Jesus showed up at all, and I don't see any hint of that, it was done in super secret. So
I mean, he talks regularly in Corinthians and Galatians about Christ being crucified.
Right.
Okay.
If you look, there's another early Christian writing, the Ascension of Isaiah, where Christ, there's the seven heavens and all, and each one of them.
What's the date on that?
That it's it's very early first century, or possibly early first century BC. I'd have to look it up to see when that is.
So it's a Christian writing that predates the first century?
That is correct. That is what I'm saying.
So
seven heavens wasn't around until more medieval time. It was
at least three heavens. But anyway, and again, I'd have to pull out the Ascension of Isaiah to see what it's actually saying. And there are layers of it that are post gospel, but the earliest layers of it are clearly pre-gospel, and they are talking about a Jesus who went down to all these layers to earth, and he did it by crucifying himself, getting himself crucified on each level, and every time he died, he'd go down to another level. It's very weird and esoteric by our standards, but that seems to be how they pictured Jesus's career.
Well, Paul uses language what are considered to be authentic Pauline letters that he talks about 1 Corinthians 15 that Christ was crucified, buried, and rose again, and he talks about, and that's the reference that you also disputed, that he talked with James, the brother of the Lord, and with Peter about this. By the way, just a little clarification, the traditional Christian understanding is that Paul did not, his origin in Christianity didn't start with any of the disciples or Christian leaders. In other words, he didn't go sit down and learn from them. He learned firsthand, but then he does go back later to authenticate that which he did, to double check.
But we don't see that. I don't think we have.
The Council of Jerusalem would be an example of that.
Well, he repeatedly tells us he got his gospel from no one.
Initially, he didn't, but he does go back to verify. so that he didn't run the race in vain or anything. So it didn't originate from Peter. It didn't originate from James, the brother of the Lord. But he does go back and sits down with them and verifies that what he has is right. The same thing he does at the Council of Jerusalem. He believes in a grace gospel. There were Judaizers that came up and confronted the Galatian heresy. Talks about that in the book of Galatians. But Paul goes back and wants to verify, this is what I told them. Let me know if I'm wrong or not. And this is where he meets and talks with James, the brother of the Lord, and also with Peter.
And I agree. When you're saying, I just don't see where he says that I verified this with them and checked it out with them.
Well, the ruling of the council is that that they don't have to be circumcised.
Sure.
All they have to do is avoid things that have been strangled, some table manner issues. But
Sure.
that Paul got the gospel right. In other words, that's the verification.
But see, that's where I think you're reading into it a little bit. And I checked with them, and they said yes, Jesus said it, and we can vouch for that. I don't see anything like that in that. And in fact, the very next passage after that, he's saying, and then I got into it with Peter face to face and told him he was wrong, and their relationship is very problematic. And I just don't see where he ever gives any impression that their relationship to Jesus is any different from his.
But backing up a step,
any other people he calls apostles, for that matter.
These are all hypothetical characters anyway. So there was no Luke. There was no.
Wait. No, they're not. No, they're
I'm
not.
asking. I'm not telling you. I'm asking you.
Yeah, let's get that real. The Jerusalem church was real. Christians were real.
There really was a Christian church there.
There really was a Christian church. There were multiple Christian movements. There were Christian movements all over the empire.
Early Gnosticism.
Yeah, I mean, Gnosticism has become a bad word, but yes, there were Christ movements of many different kinds, apparently.
By the way, David, James is an expert in Mormonism, and what he said was pretty insightful. You just said about the conflict, the real life conflict between Peter and Paul, which just seems believable. What James says is in Mormonism, you have cardboard characters, right? You can explain it better, James.
Yeah, I just, one of the differences I noticed right away after questioning Mormonism is in the Book of Mormon, every character in there is paper thin. They're either very, very good or very, very. They talk a lot. There's no different use of language, vocabulary, these kinds of things. When you see King David, and here's a man after God's own heart that has these huge struggles with family and sex and these other issues, marriage, and it's just like, I can identify with a complex character like that. And so you have that in New Testament as well, that you don't get that in the Bhagavad Gita. You don't get that in the Book of Mormon.
No, I mean, I'd stop you there. I think there are some passages in Hinduism where you do get some really interesting, complex characters. And it's the funny thing about King David is, I don't think King David existed either, or Solomon.
I mean, that goes without saying. We didn't check with you on that, but I don't think anybody existed. In fact,
no. See, I don't want you to think that. It's not that I think, no, it's all craziness. But I do have some serious problems with lots of different biblical characters.
You know, archaeologists have discovered inscription to the House of David.
Yeah, maybe. It's maybe a scripture to the House of David. But what all the evidence, archaeological evidence for David, could fit in a shoebox, according to Israel.
Well, David's up for grabs, but obviously, Moses, Abraham, that's all fiction. Yeah, no.
Sorry. Yeah, yes, all fiction. Yeah.
But look, here's the thing: Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Other gospels, I think, have him deny him 6. It's all over the place. Don't these? And for instance, you have Judas hanging himself and falling off a cliff. And I was talking to Dan. I said, these contradictions to me and inconsistencies kind of prove the reliability of the.
No! No! The opposite is true. The opposite is true. When you see them saying, "Oh, it's it's not like eyewitness testimony. These are not, Jesus said, I was wearing a blue t-shirt, and Matthew said, no, he was wearing a red t-shirt. These, like, for instance, the synoptic gospels, if you look at the details of Jesus' last week in the synoptics, they're more or less in lockstep. When you go to John, he's a completely different character, getting in trouble for completely different reasons.
Right, the Lazarus thing rather than
it's like he's completely moving at different. There's a different itinerary for different reasons. They're not alike at all. There's just no two ways those gospel stories all line up that way.
That's the point. But he's still crucified in both, the synoptics and John.
Yeah. So when you have a fictional story and then you have three other authors making their spin on it to improve it, they're keeping the same basic story.
Yeah.
David, I wanted to jump in. I know we got some questions too, and then we'll get to the audience. I think I was going to bring up my slides, but I don't know if I should do it.
Please
do.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to shotgun shell you with all these things, so I'll try to just do it one at a time.
Fair enough. And I super appreciate all the email exchanges we've had over the last
Yeah, it's
couple
been
weeks.
great. I've really been enjoying. Dave and I have been having an email chat for a couple of weeks, and it's really nice. Really enjoyed it. And I tried to share these with David earlier, but he couldn't get my slides.
I did finally get that to work.
Oh, you did. Okay. I apologize that I can't get my slides to work.
Oh no. No.
Here we go. So I thought, this is my impression. And again, I have cordial intentions here.
Absolutely.
Pardon the graphic. It's a little.
I'm not seeing any text. Is that deliberate?
Poisoning the well.
Do you see?
Here it is.
So this is the beginning. So this is a
gotcha.
quote. I wanted to get your quote right. So I put it in a slide because I don't want to paraphrase you.
Gotcha.
So this is it's in the Kindle edition. That's what I got.
Right. I recognize that. Yeah.
28 and 29 on my Kindle edition. So you're talking about bias, and I would say, well, sure, I have a bias, and there's absolutely. It's for you in the book, and I know you said in the beginning of the book that this was not for Christians. You're not writing for Christians. You're writing for
also true.
You're atheist. So I want to steel man that as well.
Let
me get the quote, and then
I'll say, when in that portion, I'm talking about why aren't more scholars on board with mythicism?
Right.
That's what I mean by a deal killer. That particular bias is a deal killer for mythicism. Whether mythicism is true or not, the problem with mythicism in biblical studies is that, like that Upton Sinclair quote I used was, it's very hard to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it.
My concern was that you say here in this quote, how many Christians do you suppose are open to entertaining the idea that the Lord and Savior they depend on for their salvation? That seems to be all inclusive, not just scholars. Not to mention, I got to err there, not to mention their salaries might never have existed. So
not to say they're wrong because of that, but just
but the thing that I'm just coming at it from a personal perspective, because I fit this quote in two different ways. I earn a salary as an apologist,
right?
And I've been a Christian for 30 years.
Right.
And I am literally, I mean, my salary, it's not much, but I love what I do.
Yeah, he only makes a couple $100,000 a year, David. So just ignore that.
Right.
The only point I'm making is there are financial reasons why institutionally biblical studies as a subfield of history seems to be on the outs with mysticism that don't necessarily have to do with the
okay, so let me see if I'm understanding what you're trying to say here. You're saying that your reference to finances and Christians considering their faith here is more a matter of mythicism becoming historically mainstream.
I think we're overthinking. All I'm talking about is, why don't more biblical scholars embrace mythicism? It's a very complex question, but one thing to keep in mind is that these are Christians. Doesn't have to be a conspiracy theory. All it has to do is Christians being Christians. They are not naturally open to the idea that Jesus didn't exist. That's all.
Okay. Okay. All right.
I'm not trying to make it anything. I mean, I do talk about these case studies of Christian
and I
scholars
wanted
who
to-
did things that were much less blasphemous, and how much it impacted them.
Right.
So how much more would they get impacted for doing anything? Being
So the
open
other-
to mythicism?
The other issue was tied to that, and I want you can clarify this. I'm asking the question. I don't want to be accusatory, of course.
Sure.
I thought that the 6 or 7 scholars that you listed that got in trouble for questioning the status quo really didn't have a place. Like, you could have skipped this chapter completely. I'm not saying that this didn't happen. I'm not denying it. I have no vested interest in these people and what their situations were. I know Mike Lacona. I was in grad school. He was one of my profs, and I've talked with him, but I don't know the particulars of any of the things that you've mentioned.
Gotcha.
I'm not denying them. I'm not.
Hold
on, Bill. Hold on, Bill, hold on.
He mentioned zombies.
Bill,
and
hold on.
he's out.
Stop. Bill, stop. Let me finish.
Let him finish, Bill.
The text here, I thought, and so I want your feedback on what you were trying to convey here, because I thought what I was interested in and what we were talking about was the historical stuff. What's the historical facts, manuscript evidence, and all that kind of stuff. Right. And I thought, I had never read anything that you had written, David. I wasn't in the club when you guys did Nailed last time. So this was I was a little shocked, given our cordial thing here.
Yeah.
I thought this was a little out of place for the historical nature of what you're trying to convey, because I think we could have done without this, these, because, if I'm a Christian, I'm writing about atheism is false, and I bring up 6 atheists that got in trouble over the last couple of years. You see where I'm going there?
Because they got in trouble, because I'm saying,
or they got the challenge or
trouble. What I did was, this is a book written for atheists, and one of the first things out of the gate is, well, all scholars agree there was a Jesus. And it's like, no, they don't. And I want to talk about those ones that I know of, that Richard Carrier knows of, who are in the closet because they can't even express that they have any doubts about Jesus' historicity.
Okay.
And so it's just addressing that opening of the doors. Like, let's not shut the door before we even get started on the evidence.
Okay. One last question then for me, and then we can talk about, I'll let everybody else talk. This was an interesting question for me. You'd mentioned myth faiths, or mythical faiths, mystery faiths.
Mystery faiths, yes.
Mystery faiths in relation to Mark 4 is where it comes up first, I think. And then you talked about the tiny scraps, which I agree. There's a lot of tiny scraps of biblical manuscripts from 150 to 200. I mean, if you go back to P52, and then that controversial scrap of Mark that came out in 2018, they finally dated it somewhere between 150 and 200.
It's later than that. Even P52 now is no, late 30s.
So I'm not contending that there aren't scraps of manuscripts laying around in this time period that you list. What I am interested in saying is that you rightly, I would think, you're interested in how can we know so much about the Bible when there's only these tiny little scraps laying around for 150
years. Let me clarify that ever so slightly. How can we know if what we have, our texts that survived, how much they match the originals?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Every
I hear what you're saying.
Copy that we have is different from every others, and we can track the deliberate changes that have been made.
Yeah,
from that time on.
So that actually leads right into what I was questioning about.
Gotcha.
The mystery religions themselves.
Yeah.
This is your quote from, and I wanted to represent it fairly. This is your quote from page 129 or 125 in the Kindle edition. You're saying that we can't, apologists and Christians, to say that we can trust our manuscripts is kind of, you're saying that we are fooling ourselves as apologists. We say we can trust the manuscripts.
And with all respect, I agree with that. I stand by that.
Okay. So that leads to my next question. I'm reading C.K. Barrett's New Testament background. I don't know if you're familiar with Barrett. It's just a collection. It's just a collection of early documents from the New Testament era. And what Barrett says is really interesting. He says the knowledge that we have of the mystery cults rests on small and fragmentary pieces of information. We don't have complete manuscripts like the Codex Vaticanus or Sinaiticus. We don't have anything like that for mystery cults.
Let me just put a pin in that.
Let me finish. Let me finish.
Okay.
Then I'll just give you the ramp.
Yeah.
So Barrett's saying, and I looked beyond Barrett, of course, and he has some mystery religions, but he makes the point that the references that we have, the extant references that we have to mystery cults and religions, generally are fragmentary, and they are only mentioned in passing by Greco-Roman scholars, centuries after the fact that they've been written. So it seems like the criteria of acceptance for mystery cults that you have is just as fragmentary, and it seems like a lot more fragmentary than what we have in the actual codices of the New Testament.
Yes.
So that's my question.
Your point is super well taken. If what he said in 1956 when he wrote that was true, I don't even think that was true in 1956 when he wrote that. And the reason I say that is because we already know, we have full-on discussions of them. We have a lot of questions about the mystery faiths because there were so many of them. For starters, they were secretive. They don't have scriptures that they allowed out. We only have it through physical evidence. We have it through textual evidence and through things like Christian writers debunking them. We have it, but we actually do have ancient writings that were mystery faith adjacent. So we don't know like what the secret passwords were. We don't know what their handshakes were or baptisms, but we do know that they had baptisms. We do know that they had sacred meals. We do know a lot about them. We just don't know as much as we would like to, or at least all of them. But we only know about 13 of them or so.
Okay.
But of the 3 that we really know well, I mean, we have writings from Herodotus. We have writings from, who we got here? I steered you to Richard Carrier's book on the historicity of Jesus, because a major chunk of the elements of Christian religion, he talks point by point by point of all the sources we have. Herodotus, Plutarch, thank you, and Euripides. Plutarch explicitly talks about the Isis and Osiris mystery faith. Herodotus strictly talks about it, where they give, that's how we know what we know about these mystery faiths.
Okay,
there's
so
other ones like the Mithraic mysteries that we know because we've seen their temples and we see, well, this image is showing this is image showing that. I would love to have their gospels for these religions that we don't have. They may have never written them down at all. We don't know. But we do know what they were saying. We know what people in the 2nd century were saying about them. We know what Christian church fathers who were responding to the accusation that Christianity was just a myth religion was saying about them. It's very interesting, in fact, that some of the things we're missing about them, like Hippolytus, the Christian writer, he had a whole 3-volume set, and in the end of book 1, he says, "Oh, and now I'm going to blow the lid off the mystery faiths and show all their secrets." That book didn't get saved by the Christians for some reason. That's, I talk about things, and I try not to sound like a conspiracy theory, but that's really suspicious to me when things like that happen.
So with the manuscripts from these mystery religions, my big question is, because this was a big significant part of your argument, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah.
Is that you have, we shared this exchange in email, that you have concerns about the time gap between when the events of the New Testament happened, when they were written, and then the earliest manuscripts that we have.
Yes.
So I'm really curious about the consistency in your historical methodology in applying these same criteria to these extant manuscripts of these mystery religions. I would like to know, what are the earliest extant copies of manuscripts that we have today that you are relying upon for this information that can be trusted, and why?
This is a good question. First of all, let me clarify one little point now. When you say I'm not concerned about the time gap, well, first of all,
it seems like you're not concerned. I apologize.
Well,
for
I mean, that's
misrepresenting.
like a secondary concern. Like we have writings from 2nd century BC, Marcus Aurelius Varro. Apparently, we have mystery writings from him that somebody just mentioned to me earlier this week. But Herodotus, who are these names? There's so many names here. Not just of the primary writings that we don't have a major gap for, or we don't have, and more importantly, we don't have reason to believe that somebody was fudging it the way we do with Christian scriptures, or even Jewish scriptures for that matter, or Islamic scriptures. We have major reasons to believe all those guys were forging, because not least of all, because Christians were complaining about it to other Christians and denying it to non-Christians. But in the case of like historical, like when you talk about Tacitus or, fill in the blank history, like you mentioned Josephus and saying something like along, I think you said, why aren't we concerned with scriptural corruption there and bias in there? We are hugely concerned. There's our huge concerns with Josephus. He, especially on all those, is very problematic.
Josephus
we have to take with a grain of salt and say, yeah, this guy may be doing Roman propaganda here. This may not be anything he wrote at all.
The earliest Tacitus manuscript is 1000 AD.
Yeah.
Earliest extant Josephus is 1300 to 1600.
Yeah.
And so again, my question is, what specific manuscripts and the dates of those? I know you named some names, but what are the dates of these extant manuscripts upon which you're relying that you consider to be reliable history?
Gotcha. That's a great question. On the top of my head, I don't know how old Herodotus is, what the historiography for that is.
Fair enough.
I do know these are generally considered reliable sources.
If I might jump in, I'm wondering though, Daniel, what your angle is. If David is not trying to use these manuscripts to establish the historicity of any personages of these mystery religions, then what does it matter whether those texts are reliable or not?
Because he's connecting them, Ken, directly to especially in when he's talking about Mark 4 specifically, he's talking about, he's saying, there's a parable in there that is a quote from Isaiah. And I am focused on this particular section in his book. I'm not generalizing outside of this particular context. That he has said that Jesus's parables, especially the one where seeing they may not see and hearing they may not hear, I speak to them in parables. And David seems to say that this doesn't make sense. If this is the Jesus we've all heard of that wants everybody to come to know him.
Can we pull up that slide, Daniel? Because that's worth talking about.
Yeah, and so my question, Ken, and my answer to you is that it's in relation to his direct tying of the mystery faiths to this passage. And here's David's quote on page 159 in the Kindle. I think it's on page 159. That may be a mistake. But this is David's quote. He says, the purpose of the parables makes absolutely no sense for the kind of Jesus that has always been preached to us. A savior who, I spelled savior wrong, sorry. A savior who can come to redeem all of us if we just ask. But it makes perfect sense if he is presenting his Jesus as a mystery faith deity. So that's why I'm asking the question about the manuscript. What's the date? What's the manuscript? What's the connection? That's what I'm trying to ask. So David, do you want to jump in on that?
I feel like there was like 3 questions there I need to answer at one point. And again, I appreciate you jumping in like that. When you talk, what I have a problem with Mark 4:11, it's not a problem, it just really strikes me, is Mark 4:11-12. It's when he talks about what's the purpose of this parable. I agree, this is totally taken from Isaiah 6. That's not even an issue. Though it's interesting that Mark doesn't tell us that he's quoting Isaiah 6. Matthew goes out of his way but constantly to say, oh, and this was done in sort of blah, blah, blah. We don't know from Mark that that's something from Isaiah 6, just like we know his last words aren't from the 21st Psalm. He never identifies that as something other than what just Jesus talking.
Okay.
Here's that's not even to the point. That what I'm trying to say is Mark 4:11-12, when he talks about what's the purpose of these parables that I'm telling you, he says, to you has been given the mystery of the kingdom of heaven so that you will be saved. But I say things in parables so that they won't. The outsiders won't be saved. That's the part that makes no sense to me if we're talking about anything except a mystery faith God.
Now this is a commentary I'm reading. R.T. France is pretty conservative, so I know you'll probably dismiss it.
I agree with him here. I totally agree with him here. Yeah,
but
I don't
he's
have
saying,
a problem with the connection of the parable of the sower. I think he's exactly right.
Yeah, but what France is saying here is really interesting. He's not saying, France suggests that the Isaiah passage and then by implication Mark's quote is that Jesus is not using parables as a magic incantation to stuff people's ears and close their eyes. Like he speaks it like hocus pocus. Rather, what in the Hebraic sort of way that it is, it's sort of I don't know the right Hebrew term, but what parables do And what Jesus is saying is not that I'm trying to cause unbelief by speaking parables. I'm speaking parables to lay down the gauntlet and show the dividing line between those on the outside and those on the inside. Because as France goes on to note, Mark has made this public. All of this information is not secret anymore. This isn't any kind of, I'm trying to he's laying down the gauntlet between the Jews and those who he's called to the kingdom. So he's not causing unbelief. He's revealing unbelief by speaking in parables. That's what France is suggesting, and I think that's a perfectly legitimate explanation. You may disagree.
I mean, it's kind of neither here nor there for me to hear him say that. The parable is about what the parable is about, and that's like he and I are on the same mindset for that. What it gets for me is that well, it's interesting, first of all, that word in most translations is saying the secret of
right,
the kingdom of heaven.
Mysterion, or I think it's what it is.
Mysterion. It's not crypto, it's mysteria. It's definitely, he's saying the mystery has been given to you. And that's Paul in his epistles is constantly using mystery terminology in the exact context and way that we would expect it. Early Christian authors like Origen and Clement of Alexandria, they also do this and talk about Christianity as a mystery faith very closely. And again, I highly recommend you take a look at what Rick has to say on his section on the mystery faiths, because the scholarship there to me is just conclusive.
Can you, okay, so I'll just let this go. Final, just wrapping up, tying loose ends, and then I'm done. So in the passage that we just discussed, and your comment about tying Mark, the Jesus of Mark's parable, to a mystery religion, what's the manuscript? Where are you pulling that from?
Itself as a mystery religion is what I'm
But
saying.
Where are you pulling that? Where are you making that direct historical connection? What's the where can I go to see that?
Is there it sounds like you're expecting me to pull out a mystery faith handbook and say, look, here's what
yes, yes, I am.
That's well, I mean, we'd have to do it the long way around. It's like, that's something that's very weird to me for our Jesus, who came to earth after all to save us all from sins, to have him say, okay, you guys, you're in the club. Here's the mystery. It's been given to you. Those people I speak in parables, so they won't understand. See, that's how I see that. That's very weird to me on anything except a mystery.
So it's just,
and
it's just weird. It's not, we don't have a manuscript. It's just weird to you. Is that where we're at?
If you want to put it that way, I would.
I mean, I don't want to.
Sophisticatedly, but you know what? Sure.
Maybe the irony here is he doesn't understand.
What side of the parable are you on, Mr. Fitzgerald? Yeah, no, thank you, David. You were very thorough and kind enough to spend the time in the email. We talked about this, by the way, just for everybody. We've been batting this back and forth for the last week through email.
Continue that too.
Sure, he's been really great to humor me. And
maybe you can put the emails, if they're not private, up on the Friends of the Atheist and Christian Book Club, and let us all see that.
Daniel's fine with it. I'm totally fine.
I'm fine. Go for it, David, if you want to do it. It's there's nothing in there I'm ashamed of.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, however you want to do that. That's
all right. I'm all done for the night. Whoever is next.
we have at least one lined up. I have a quick question for you, David. In talking about Galatians, you mentioned that the issue of James, the Lord of our the brother of our Lord. You said that you pointed to the Greek. Can you give me a little bit of explanation? What is it in the Greek that causes you?
But I will just say, let's look at the book, because I talk about it in this book. Sorry, in volume 2 of Jesus Mything in Action. It would be a very tedious breakdown for me to do that off the top of my head. But
fair enough. So
not as a cop out, but yeah.
By the way, David, have you ever taken any Greek classes?
I have not. All my Greek is secondary from
because
from studying this. Yeah.
When you debate these Christian PhDs, I mean, they take years of Greek. They're going to pull the Greek card on you every time.
Oh, sure. And to be fair, there's mythicists like Joseph Atwell, who I have no respect for whatsoever. He knows great Greek, but his theories are ridiculous. Anytime you see a mythicist saying, "Oh, this was all invented by the Romans," you can rest assured that there's going to be a mythicist like me or Richard Carrier who's like, shut up, get out of town. You know, if you're smart enough to concoct that, you're smart enough to know why that completely fails. Yeah.
All right. Ken, I believe you got a question. Ken, you're up.
Yeah, thanks for joining our meeting. I wasn't here the first time you came, but I thoroughly enjoyed your book. I'm not a mythicist. I'm an agnostic, atheist-leaning agnostic, and I was brought somewhat birthed into skepticism by Robert Price in part. So he's kind of my spiritual, what do you call it? Midwife.
Oh, midwife, yes.
Yeah. So I know he's a mythicist. I really respect Bart Ehrman as well, like you do, and kind of gravitated more to his position over time.
Well, it's interesting how that's shifted too, especially since he wrote "Did Jesus Exist?" It's like things that he says he thinks were established, he's backing away from and realizing they're not as steady as he thought.
Yeah, and one of my points that I wanted to raise was that I think probably 80% of what you write in this book, Bart Ehrman would agree with. I mean, he makes the same points, right?
Right.
You just take it to a different conclusion. Like
that's exactly right. Honestly, I'm so glad you said that, because that's exactly right. Like when it comes to mark and priority, to the synoptic problem, all these other things, we're in complete agreement with the consensus. The critics of mythicism, one of the things they like to do is like treat us like they were this crazy pariah way out here. And it's like, nope, we're just, and it's like, if we're wrong, so be it. It's no skin off my back if Jesus was just a failed apocalyptic prophet.
Yeah, and I'm kind of on the other flip side of that very thought. I mean, to me, it's like it's not something I really invest a lot of time studying, because I don't have a bone to pick about it, whether he existed or not. I tend to kind of gravitate towards what seems to be the scholarly consensus, and I know you addressed that at length in your book. One thing that I did note, though, is that over time, the scholarly consensus has moved away from the idea that Moses and Abraham existed to now that they did exist. So despite the fact that there's
turned off my picture.
Oh, wait, hang on. I think is it Donald? I think we're hearing you.
We got it. It's got
all
it.
right.
Yeah, you're right. Sorry, David.
So you go to some lengths to show how all these seminaries and institutions are populated by Christians, and have pressure to never to fold under the idea that Jesus was non-existent. But on the other hand,
it's a conspiracy, not to say that Christians are evil for doing it. It's just like, that's a bias.
Exactly. So I want to launch from there and say, well, somehow, even though there was originally resistance to the idea that Moses didn't exist, they overcame that resistance over time, right? So in spite of that pressure, they bowed to what probably are the facts, and that Moses didn't exist. So why couldn't that happen with Jesus? Why don't I just wait as a layperson? Why don't I just wait until the scholars kind of all come to make a respectable conclusion together that he probably didn't exist. In the meantime, I'm kind of with the scholars, because I'm a nobody, right? So
and I'm a nobody too. And so none of these are my ideas for the most part, maybe 3 out of this whole series of I've ever written. But for instance, let me just do a shameless promotion for my next book I'm working on right now. It's about the evolution of all the religions, all the major world religions, and looking at the backstory of all of them, all the top 10 figures. Most of the Old Testament figures, the Islamic Old Testament figures, Jesus, and maybe John the Baptist and Paul, definitely Paul in the New Testament, and everybody else from Buddha to the Jains and all the other religions out there. And it's so fascinating to see the similarities in the way their religions unfold. It's like they all seem to have really weird silences about the first 100 years or so.
Yeah,
and it's like,
I'm glad you raised that, because that was going to be my next. I had 2 questions, and that was going to be my next one.
And so it's leading me to think that it's normal for world religion to start out with a completely mythical founder. And I'm hoping when this book comes out.
Mhm. Well,
that
I wanted
will-
to actually take it from the opposite perspective, in that
Mm.
the religions that we know have started in the historical era, let's say in the last couple hundred years.
Sure.
You know,
Like
Joseph Smith,
Sikhism, for
or
instance.
the Baha'u'llah of the Baha'i faith, and
Yeah.
you know, various others. The one who started Swedenborgianism. They all had
Yeah.
identifiable people that started
Right.
those movements, right?
Right.
So it seems like if you're wanting to use like the criterion of like parallelism, like what is parallel? Like if you
and it's not
apply
parallel, but
present back to the past, it's
Yeah.
like we know that most modern religious movements start with an actual person.
right.
So chances are, just background probability, not knowing anything about the history, that any movement, even 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, would probably, more on balance, more likely than not, have been started by a real person, not just kind of come out of the woodwork. You know, it would have an identifiable person. That may have, you know, had accreted legendary embellishments over time, you know, to where the original founder is somewhat obscured or completely obscured maybe, but they still had identifiable. Initially, they had identifiable founders. If we're to use the present as a guide to the past, is what I'm saying.
Well, here's the thing. I think that changed about 500 years ago, because Sikhism definitely, I thought, assumed was historical until I started looking at the backstory and realizing that of their top 10 founder figures, the first 5 seem to be completely mythical. And it really starts halfway through there. And that pattern I see through all the ancient religions.
So
Since we got into
somehow magically, not magically, but you think that somehow globally, the global culture changed in the last 500 years to where, you know, suddenly human nature has changed in terms of how religions develop? Or
well, it's a modern world, so it's harder to fake the origins of a religion in a way that wasn't so hard pre-literary, pre-photography, pre-everything else. And like, for instance, there was a Joseph Smith, big time, but the author of the Book of Mormon? No. The Angel Moroni? No. And you can even go, I mean, there's other examples like QAnon movement. That's a total mythical figure. Probably 2 guys, a father and son in the Philippines, if I understand correctly. But
I'm not saying they're not exceptions, but it seems like on balance that there usually is some sort of a founder, at least in the ones we know of. And if you project that into the past, then you would think that the background probability would be more in favor of having an actual founder, even though time has obscured them and we didn't have cameras back then or modern journalism. But I tend to be, you know, I tend to follow Ehrman on the historicity of Jesus. I could be wrong. I don't think that's wrong. I mean, my instinct is that he existed. I'm not going to go down to the mat on it, but I mean, I did enjoy your book. It's very, very interesting. I've heard most of those things that you've mentioned, but I think it's good to have all those things in one place, showing that like the development of and especially the idea that Mark's Jesus was very human and flawed. That is something that you know, it's really jarring to think about, because we tend to think about him as like all the gospels as being having the same agenda.
It's striking for me when you see it the way Mark wrote it, that he's fallible and human. All of a sudden, his temptation in desert makes sense. All of a sudden, his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, all that makes sense. It's like John's Jesus, who's just slumming and is super Jesus and doesn't care if anybody knows he's God or not. That makes no sense. It just from a story logic sense. But when you're thinking, oh, this is a human guy, boom, it does make sense that he'd be tempted. And you know, Satan offers him all the kingdoms of the world. That would be tempting for somebody. Wouldn't be tempting for the eternal Son of God. You know, screw you, Satan.
Those are all great points and food for thought for me. Another item of food for thought was one of the big reasons I've traditionally been a historicist is because of, you know, Bart Ehrman's idea that, well, and it's not just his idea, but the notion that there was never before Jesus a thought that the Messiah would be would
that's-
suffer and die, right?
No, that's not true.
Uh,
That's just flat out
and,
not true.
and so, nobody would invent somebody dying because
Except
that's not
Isaiah,
something we thought
Who
about.
did. Yeah.
Right. Well, Isaiah was talking about is the nation of Israel primarily.
Exactly. But that's what they drew upon. Mark
Mhm.
drew upon that, and 21st Psalm, and even when you read the 21st Psalm,
Mhm.
it only has one verse that's applicable. Rest doesn't apply to Jesus at all. And yet
Right.
we know that's where
But do you-
it's word for word,
I am interested to know a little bit more about kind of historical references dating before Jesus to Jewish interpretations of Isaiah 53 that saw that as a messianic figure.
Yeah.
Because I think Brady helped me see there's Jonathan Ben something or other, one of in the Targum, something like a couple hundred years BC. I'm not sure what the date of that was.
It was probably later
Yeah.
than that, but
Rashi, I think, was like 10th or 11th century,
Yeah.
something like that.
I
11th,
think
12th
most of the
century.
Targums are all at least
Okay. Yeah. Well, there
Let
was
them go back to, like,
something,
third
Brady,
century.
that you pointed out to me that gave me food for thought, that made me think that, oh, well, maybe there was an idea among Jews that people,
sure.
Jews did think that Isaiah 53 was messianic,
Right.
before Jesus.
And one point about that is during that first century, there were so many different types of Jews with so many different ideas about the Messiah that whatever happened in the first century, there was at least one group of Jews that said, yeah, we picked that all along.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
and
here
let
I
me-
stand. I'm still a historicist, but I do
Yeah.
appreciate
give this
your approach.
give this book a check and see what you think, because a lot of the things you mentioned.
Yeah, we had him in our club a couple years ago. I
Ah.
think maybe 3 years ago. Interesting.
I
Yeah.
think the way you were talking about, Ken, before, the principle of analogy, is that what?
Yeah, the principle of analogy, like
Yeah.
how where miracles happen in the New Testament. Robert Price talks about the principle of analogy. Well, today we have people with epilepsy, and then they talked about people with demon possession. Well,
Yeah.
by the principle of analogy, those are probably those are probably not demon possessions. They were probably epilepsy or something like that.
Right.
And so I'm taking that principle of analogy and saying, well, if most of the religions that are born in the last couple hundred years are born through the agency of a particular person, then we can probably extrapolate that using a principle of analogy and push that back to Muhammad or Buddha or whatever.
But I think there's some pushback that you could be good, because the situation in modern to semi-modern times isn't analogous to the situation in those times. Like when you look at the story of Sikhism, or let's get even more recent religion. Well, Mormonism. Like, there's no way to not have Joseph Smith be the founder, because we know way too much about him, and his name is all over his writings, Doctrines and Covenants. It's like, we've got good evidence for him.
But that's exactly my point.
When you go back in time,
yeah, but we didn't have
there's
that kind of coverage.
all of
back
them
then.
have this weird blackout period where you can't. There's no.
But maybe that's just because there was not the same type of journalism and rigor back then. So that explains
But here's
why
the
we
thing.
don't have it.
We know there was non-mythical facts about Joseph Smith that we can determine. We don't know that. We don't even know who wrote the Gospels. We only know things about them that we can discern from the clues that they leave, sometimes inadvertently.
Yeah. Anyway, it's
But
not a strong argument. It's just kind of a clue to me
No, I
that
hear you.
maybe they existed, but they just kind of have been mythicized to a certain extent.
And
but-
again, no skin off my nose if that's how it turned out. I'm very curious to see what you think of the new book. I think you'll find it a really interesting read.
David,
David, in Bart
Go ahead,
Ehrman's
Bill.
book, How Jesus Became God, you see a trajectory where, Mark, you have low Christology, and then these gospel writers seem to impose deity upon him. When you get to John, it's full-blown deity.
Absolutely.
Doesn't that make perfect sense that you would start with a historical core and then
Except everything about Mark's gospel, we can pick. This came from this came from this. And even of the mundane things like, oh, he cursed a fig tree, but it wasn't fig season. And, it sounds like a goofy story from a human standpoint that, oh, well, there's Jesus kind of being a jerk. But it's a allegory. It's an allegory about Israel. And
that's what Bart
why-
Ehrman.
I think one of the things you guys are missing. Yeah, one of the
Everything.
things I think you guys might be missing is you want to project a late date for the Gospels, and then well, you don't get really
James, I don't
till
want to.
John.
I don't
Well,
want to.
okay, well,
But it
to
seems to
draw
me.
the conclusion of this evolution
Yeah.
of Jesus being God, but the earliest documents, not the Gospels. It's the
Right.
Pauline epistles that you have
Philippians.
what's considered to be the authentic. I mean, even the skeptics and most atheists agree that Paul at least wrote maybe, was it 5 or 7 of the
Six. I vote 6.
okay,
but
6. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, in that you have clear deity theology in that. So
Right. What you don't have is a human.
earliest documents we have, and you're looking within, Paul's ministry within a decade of the crucifixion, is got a very high Christology, higher than Mark, in many ways.
I don't know if it's higher. Well, it's higher in the fact that Mark's is human and Paul's is not.
Well, that would be pretty high in comparison
Yeah.
if you're
So
right
I'll
about
give-
that.
I'll
So,
give you that.
but that's the earliest that we have. That's not a later development. It took Mark all these years after Paul to come up with this what Bill likes to call the bare bones gospel.
What you're calling a high Christology, I call a Jewish version of the mystery faiths. It's high because his is completely mythical. Paul's is completely mythical. The book of Hebrews is completely mythical. And
Well,
after
mythical,
Mark
the
wrote
idea
his
of
Gospels,
Jesus being
all of a
God.
sudden it's historicized.
The idea of Jesus being God. We did that book, how Jesus became God, and we also did the rebuttal book, how God became Jesus. But the idea that it was developmental, the earliest documents, we can date these to within a decade or so of the resurrection or the crucifixion itself, have the highest Christology. Maybe John's gospel would be, and by higher, I don't mean mystical. I mean, Jesus is God.
Well,
no,
like Philippians
Beginning
2,
was
5 through 11.
with God, the word was God.
Philippians 2, 5 through 11 says, even though he was in the form of God, he gave that up. Remember?
Yeah. Kenosis hymn. Yep.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know what you think the relationship is between Mark and Paul. Did Mark, was he familiar with Paul and drawing from
Yes,
Paul?
absolutely.
Why did he take
Because
Paul?
he
Why
took
would he take a Jesus who was exalted like that and make him more down to earth and human? Just kind of trying to understand your perspective on that.
right. In my humble opinion, I agree with the scholars who say that what he was doing was he was taking the Jesus that we get from Paul, the earliest Christians, the names of earliest Christians, and creating what if God had been on earth? What if that's why he didn't save Jerusalem, is because he was going to save us spiritually. Everything that Mark writes seems to be in reaction to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. That's why scholars think he wrote the book. They think it was written shortly thereafter. The little apocalypse, it's in Matthew. Is it Matthew? Reads like a survival guide to those who are going through that. I lost my train of thought.
By the way, guys, Bill has a question. He's been very patiently waiting.
Oh, sure. And I completely lost my train of thought as well. So a good time to jump in, Bill.
Yeah, first of all, David, I just finished reading yesterday your new book, and I'm a big fan of time travel, science fiction, and that. So
time shards. Oh,
yeah.
Did you read all 3 or just the first one?
I've only read the first one so far.
Oh.
But yeah, I liked how you use time travel in mything, Jesus mything in action there. That
yeah.
And the title kept reminding me of Aspirin's mything series of books.
Yes.
But
yes. Yeah.
But yeah, I was raised Catholic, but declared myself an atheist as a teenager. And I really think it was my Catholic upbringing that had me thoroughly convinced that Jesus was a real person. I didn't believe in the magical, the miracle aspects, whatever you want to call them.
Right.
And I think that's true with a lot of, Catholics, former Catholics, or, just any former Christian. The way we're taught it just feels like Jesus is a real person.
And as an ex-Southern Baptist, same for me. I was an atheist for years before it even crossed my mind that there wasn't a Jesus. And that only became about because I started looking like Well, you know what? I wonder which of the Gospels is giving us the real Jesus, because they're obviously not all talking about the same guy. And once you start pulling on that thread, pretty soon you have no sweater, as I say in Nailed. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that was the other thing too, is that in reading mything, I kept having to go back to Nailed because there's so much stuff. And of course, I read that probably a decade ago. So,
Yeah.
you know, there's things in there that I'm like, oh yeah, I kind of forgot this part and that part, because there is so much to it.
Yeah.
But I think that's one of the problems, is trying to convince, especially former Christians. You know, we all think atheists were all, you know, unified, which we're not even close.
Right.
And it does astound me that there's a lot of atheists who are, well, but Jesus was still a real person.
And you know,
So,
that's
Bill,
why
are
I
you a
wrote
Methodist?
Jesus Mythic. When I wrote
Yes.
Nailed, I thought, oh, that's all that needs to be said. I'm done. It's like, oh no. And it's like, again, I didn't write this for Christians. No offense, Christians, but I wrote this because this is an argument that atheists are having. And I'm happy if I'm wrong to, you know, doff my cap to whichever Jesus turned out to be more plausible.
But Bill just said that he finds your arguments compelling, right, Bill?
Yes, I am a mythicist, very much so. I'm on
nice.
board, but it took me a while, because I, you know, as a new atheist in that, I don't know how many years it was before I started finding more of this information on the mythicist angle of things. And at first I'm like, that just doesn't seem right. And then as you read more and more, you start going, no, it's really making sense. And I think your book, Richard Carrier especially. Now, I will say that I think it was his latest Carrier book. There were so many damn footnotes in it, and I did not read any of the footnotes. You know, I'm just like, no, you know, that's a scholarly study if you do that. And it's like, I'm not, that's not my field, you know.
Honestly, Bill, I've gotten so much flack, not from Christians, because I mean, of course I'm going to get it from Christian, but from other atheists, that I footnote everything now. So yeah.
Well, your footnotes are readable. I mean, his are like, I don't know. They're difficult to get through, you know.
So, Bill, which of David's arguments did you find most compelling?
Which? Wow, there are so many, but I think it's just a complete lack of actual history, you know, documents of any kind. And, you know, the part of it is that, okay, we've been looking, you know, modern, you know, particularly Christian scholars have been looking for the evidence of Jesus, and it's just not there. And, you know, every time you go looking for it, it's like you come up with nothing, or you come up with a forgery. And
something that's not even about Jesus, or something that's taken from the Old Testament. Yeah.
And even, you know, a lot of Christians, I mean, they'll come up with things like, well, you know, if you're a mythicist, you should consult Lee Strobel's books, you know, and he's got, I mean, his creatively titled, you know, The Case for Christ and The Case for the Resurrection. And I've read both of those, and I've actually had people give me those books, and
well, that's
they're
the
not
thing,
good.
Those books were written for Christians. And again, let me just, James, Daniel, thank you so much for having me here. And I super appreciate it. And I do not mean any disrespect. But Lee Strobel is such a liar. He's such a liar. I've done a whole talk about what a huge liar he is, and his movie. Have you seen the movie Case for Christ?
Oh God!
Oh my God!
Well, maybe when we have him at the club, you can join and talk to him in person about it, and that would be maybe a more respectful way of.
Sean McDowell.
We've had Sean McDowell as one of our authors, but
I love Sean McDowell, and I love his dad. I don't respect his dad's literary output. But Lee Strobel, I have no respect for that guy whatsoever.
David, I have to disagree with you on your proselytizing. You said, do not bring up, did Jesus exist, to Christians. Let me tell you what, that's the first thing I bring up, because most Christians are totally clueless. They do not believe in a historical Jesus. They couldn't put Jesus on history if their life depended on it. They don't know about criteria of embarrassment, multiple attestation. And here's the thing, they don't care. What they believe in is their pastor's faith, the community, their peer group. They have
Ron,
no
Ron blew
clue
the ad
about
hominem
Jesus.
whistle on you there, Bill.
I had a follow-up question for Bill Hossman, if I could. Is
Oh.
Bill still with us? Yeah, there you are,
Yeah.
Bill. Just a quick question, Bill. Is this your first book club?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, welcome to the club. Thanks so
Yeah.
much for participating.
Yeah,
Appreciate
good
it.
to
Thank you.
have
It's the Thursday Dallas Christian group that turned me on to this. So
Oh, great.
Oh.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And
Bill,
I'm
I
not
love
in
your
Dallas, so I'm
screensaver
in
behind you.
Ventura, California.
Yes.
Bill, I
Oh,
love your
all right,
screen
welcome to the
background.
club. And we had a question also from Adam Schiller, and Adam is putting his toddler to bed right now, I think, but he asked if somebody could ask it for him. So I'll ask this, David. It says, from my understanding of the mythicist position, earliest Christians believed that Jesus was crucified by demons in a level of the heavens, outer space to us, that had copies of earthly things, cities, roads, trees, etc. Here's my question.
Right.
Do we know that when these early Christians thought this crucifixion took place? Did they think it happened earlier in the Earth's history or at the same time as Jesus supposedly walked, somewhere around 33 AD? When did they think this event happened?
Right. That's a great question. If anything, so many things we don't know. And I was talking about the ascension of Isaiah. It occurred to me that we don't know what the earliest level of that is. We just know it was that the later part of it was either very close to the Gospels or just after the Gospels. But if anything, Christianity could be even older than AD 30 and go back to sometime in the first century. We just don't know. We just don't have enough evidence or to give a firm answer to that question, in my humble opinion.
David, you had said a couple of times tonight and in your book, and I thought this was one of my other questions that I had for you. And I don't think I asked this in the exchange, but since you said it, I thought I would bring it up.
Yeah.
From what I know, I'm no biblical scholar myself, but from what I understand, we have a handful of the codices that we have with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John on it with the names.
Right.
The kata Yohani and the kata Mark, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
They range in age from the 2nd to the 5th century. Some of them are full, some of them are partial, some of them we only have a couple of pages.
Yeah, let me just put a pin in that. From the year 180, that's the first time that we get those names attached from Irenaeus of Lyon.
Right.
And as far as fragments go, we don't get like full individual books of the New Testament until way getting
300
close.
Is the Vaticanus at 300 and Sinaiticus is
4th
somewhere
century.
around there.
Yep.
Yeah.
And those of course are notorious. I talk about because they don't have the same books as each other, and they have books we don't have. We have books they don't have.
So my question for you, and this is always something that it's an objection I hear, and I've not really heard a solid answer on this. We have these names themselves.
Yeah.
There are no extant, and it doesn't mean there wasn't ever, but there are no extant manuscripts in our possession now that have blanks or any other names. So let me finish up.
References to the writings, and then saying, "Oh, we have memoirs of the apostles." For instance.
Right. I'm just focused on for concision here, conciseness here. I'm just focused on the actual Greek manuscripts, or there may be a couple of Latin ones as well, with the names.
Right.
And I'm wondering, from your mythicist position, what is the best historical explanation for why these names, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and why, if these were later additions, fabrications, however you want to say it, why were these? First question would be, do you think they were added in the 2nd century, like suddenly the names appear, or do you think they were added long before that? And then the second question is, why these names?
Gotcha. Okay, let me see if I can juggle both of those at the same time when I answer. Sure. And when I say I think that, it's like I agree with these scholars who think that, because I think it's the consensus that these names were attributed sometime in the 2nd century. We don't know when exactly, because we've got like most fragments will fit on a credit card, so it's very
Sure.
hard to know even how much of a particular book we have intact. That said, why those names? It was kind of an arms race, we think. It's because somebody said, oh, well, this is from Matthew. Oh, we've got another one from Matthew here. Oh, well, this is from Peter. The John gospel is really interesting because there's nothing tying it to John, even in the gospel itself. It says that it was written by the disciple Jesus loved and the beloved disciple. And that character, the beloved disciple who's supposed to be the author of John, is never identified as John, and he's been inserted into the synoptics narrative. So it's like you have all these events happening in the synoptics. Well, in John, that gospel, it's the beloved disciple who jumps in. It's like he's a time traveler and popped into these existing stories. It's very weird to read his placement, and he doesn't even show up throughout the gospel. It's just towards the passion narrative that he starts showing up. And there are good reasons to think that the author was being cute and saying, oh, this is Lazarus, the guy that Jesus loved, the guy he raised from the dead. That's the real author of this book. Maybe so, maybe not. But it's much more convincing that it could be Lazarus than John. That was only because, well, it couldn't be Matthew, it couldn't be Mark, it had to be this, had to be somebody who was at the transfiguration, so it must be John, boom, boom, boom. And it was just scriptural guesswork on their part. But why those names? They chose the best name, like the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Peter. Those were also names that were thrown out there. And there's probably were multiple versions of those as well. These are just the ones that have survived today that we know about, or at least were referenced to in things that have survived today.
So you wouldn't, I don't think I read this in the book, but would you be necessarily arguing that the church added these to bolster their authority as they circulated?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Oh,
If that is the case, if they're using these names that they've affixed to bolster their authority, why two non-apostolic individual names?
Because
why
they can be tied to Peter and to Paul. That's really the only good reason, because somebody else beat them to their favorite apostle, apparently.
And so you're arguing that this name, affixing the names to manuscripts, was begun in the late 2nd century.
I don't know if it was late 2nd century. I don't know when it was. I just know scholars think it happened in the 2nd century. I do want to say the whole business about this gospel according to Mark, according to Matthew, the kata part, that was a ancient trope to show that this was not by Mark or by Matthew, but handed down to us, the tradition of this. And that's a trope, an ancient trope, because most ancient writers would say, this is this by Galen, this is this by that. They wouldn't be coy about who wrote it. But when they did do according to, it's indicating that, well, this is how it was passed down to our generation.
How do you think, and I know this is complete speculation, I'm not trying to corner you, but how do you think, given the way manuscripts circulated in the ensuing centuries of early Christianity, that they were able, after these manuscripts have been, let's just say 100 years, that all these manuscripts were circulating for 100 years and then the names were added? How do you think that they got 100% agreement on all the names and all the manuscripts after they've been in circulation for so long? I'm
sure it was a political dogfight, like everything else that they debated about. There's so much factional conflict in the early Christianity. I don't know if you've read Ehrman's book, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. Or Forgery and Counter-Forgery. It's like you see that they had no problem changing things to how they think it should have been. In fact, in Vaticanus, I think it's Vaticanus or Sinaiticus, I have a picture in Jesus Myth in Action of one of the pages, and there's a scribal note saying, don't change it, you fool and knave, keep the old reading.
So there's no, so really, when it comes to the names, I just want to get your position clear. I don't want to misrepresent you. You're saying that we know these individuals did not pen these gospels.
Right. And there's various
Okay.
reasons for each of them why we know that. Yeah.
But we don't have any kind of textual tradition that tells us that, correct?
Yeah.
The version of history that
Well,
you're giving
all
me,
of them
we don't have
originally-
documented.
Well, here's the thing. All of them originally seem to be anonymous, to have been anonymous originally. The screen is doing a really
Yeah,
strange
James
thing.
is getting
Sorry,
ready
I
for
was trying
some-
to
Oh,
share
do I need to worry
something.
about that? Okay.
No.
Still here?
Keep talking.
Okay.
You're fine. Keep going.
Yeah, they all appear to have originally been anonymous. And then, yeah, at some point, somebody, probably after the Apostolicon came from Marcion, that was the theological Sputnik that went out and said, oh, he's got a collection of scriptural writings. We need to start a collection of scriptural writings. That's probably what sparked that. So whatever time frame we can pin on Marcion, I'd be willing to bet it was post that and shortly post that.
Let me see if I
Okay.
can, let me see if I can steelman Daniel's point.
Yeah.
And because I don't accept the authorship, traditional authorship, but I think the point he might be making is that if these were originally penned without an author, and then sometime later they unanimously took on the authors that were currently associated with them, to me, it seems like it would be more plausible that they originally had those authors attributed to them, and that was the source for the well from which all of the rest sprung. You can explain that. You can explain the fact that there's a unanimous consensus that they all have the same attributions. If the original manuscript had that attribution in it, then if that attribution was made sometime later, because
But
then
it
you
doesn't
have
seem like
disagreements.
there were attributions. Or in the case of John's, it was a very indirect attribution. And that may have been after the fact. That may have been added on after the fact.
But
as
Ken,
well.
you're right. That's kind of what I was getting at.
Okay.
So like for the Gospel of Peter, I think as far as we know, that was always attributed to Peter, right? Because from the beginning.
See, I don't know. This is the thing. I just don't know. I
Right.
don't know.
Yeah, it raises a lot of questions. Like, I
It's an
mean,
interesting question.
the
Yeah.
misattribution was very common. That's not the
Yeah.
thing. That's not the point of contention. The point of contention is how later manuscripts unanimously
Right.
took on a specific author, and there was no disagreement among all the.
Yeah, and to your
Well,
point, Ken, I don't think there's any dispute that even the early church fathers didn't know who wrote Hebrews, and so we actually don't have any name
Right.
attributed to that. You
But
could say it was
a lot of them push for Paul. Oh, this is
Sure.
Paul. That's why it's in there.
if you held a gun to my head and said, "Well, who do you think that was?" I would say Paul, but with an
And
M.
to be fair, I think that whatever Paul was preaching in the early part of Christianity sounded a lot like the book of Hebrews.
I would agree. It's Pauline in some way, but with the book of Hebrews, we absolutely know it was anonymous by going back. Even the church fathers, like, we don't know who wrote that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But with the Gospels, Ken's point is kind of what I was just saying. It just seems
Gotcha.
real hard to go through 200 years of that, what you call the dark blackout period,
Yeah.
and to have to say with sort of epistemic certainty that we know these men didn't do this. I'm more of what Ken was trying to say. I don't know if Ken believes it or not. Where you start off in the oral tradition, knowing that
Right.
this came from Mark and Peter, this
Gotcha.
came from Luke and Theophilus writing. You know,
And I take your point. I take your point. Here's my thing, though. When you read Mark, when you read Matthew, they don't identify themselves as eyewitnesses. They don't read like eyewitness accounts. And I
Right.
know that
Yeah.
there's some.
That's why most
Yeah.
scholars don't accept that they were written by the traditional authors.
Well, and there's other things, like, for instance, Matthew lets lines like, and this is believed even unto today, that kind of, these little things. Luke, I mean, he starts out his gospel by saying, there's so many people writing gospels right now. It seemed to me to be a good idea to go research, see the story as it's come down to our generation and do the work. And then he steals Matthew and Mark's story, basically, and in my humble opinion. And
Okay. Well, thanks for that. Appreciate the thoroughness. Thank you. James is ready to do advertising here.
Well, I was going to do something else here. I was going to get a comment. We had earlier in the book club we did the anthology that variations in mythicism.
Varieties of mythicism. Yeah. What did you think of that book?
It was interesting. Our guest was Robert Price, and we focused on his chapters in the book, and to me, it was almost, it came across to me as like, we're going to throw everything out there and hope something sticks.
That was my problem with it too. It's like,
Yeah, it was like if any of the varieties were true, then all the rest had to be false.
well,
So,
I mean,
for example, there was a whole chapter in there about based on the mythicism of John Allegro, who was teaching that Jesus was actually a mushroom, and
right.
it seemed like that their prize evidence was, I can't remember the details, but some French chapel from the Middle Ages that had a portrait on the wall that looked either a tree or a mushroom. There we go, case closed.
Right.
So
Exactly.
it was
And
yeah, I talked with Robert about that, and that's the second time he's been our guest at the book club as well. So we're familiar with the mythicism thing. And this came up earlier too, but I wanted you to address it specifically since you've been talking about Bart Ehrman. Basically, Ehrman wrote the book, of course, Did Jesus Exist?, which is a refutation of mythicism. Here's part of what he said, and then I have a little video clip and want you to just comment on it. Despite this enormous range of opinion, there are several points on which virtually all scholars of antiquity agree. Jesus was a Jewish man known to be a preacher and teacher who was crucified, a Roman form of execution, in Jerusalem during the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea. Even though this is the view of nearly every trained scholar on the planet, it's not the view of a group of writers who are usually labeled and often label themselves as mythicists. And then I have a video clip. I know you've probably seen, I think you refer to it in your book indirectly, but it was when Bart Ehrman earned the Man of the Year award, the Emperor Has No Clothes award from the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
Yes.
And you can barely hear the question. Somebody asked, well, don't we not have any evidence that Jesus even existed? And Bart took a moment to take him to task. So let me play this, and I hope I have audio on this. If not, I'll skip it, but then I'd like you to comment on that. In the book, you made a reference to it was a no true Scotsman error on the part of Bart Ehrman, but I want you to kind of explain that to us and what the no true Scotsman argument is and why you think it fits. Can you hear that?
Yeah, well, I do. I mean, that's why I wrote the book. Well, I mean, okay, yeah. I mean, I have a whole book on it. I mean, so there is a lot of evidence. I mean, there is so much evidence that it is not. I mean, I know in the crowds you all run around with, it's commonly thought that Jesus did not exist. Let me tell you, once you get outside of your conclave, there's nobody who. I mean, this is not even an issue for scholars of antiquity. It is not an issue for scholars. There is no scholar in any college or university in the Western world who teaches classics, ancient history, New Testament, early Christianity, any related field who doubts that Jesus existed. Now, that is not evidence. That is not evidence. Just because everybody thinks so doesn't make it evidence. But if you want to know about the theory of evolution versus the theory of creationism, and every scholar in every reputable institution in the world believes in evolution, it may not be evidence, but if you've got a different opinion, you better have a pretty good piece of evidence yourself. The reason for thinking Jesus existed is because he is abundantly attested in early sources. That's why. And I give the details in my book. Early and independent sources indicate that certainly that Jesus existed. One author that we know about knew Jesus' brother and knew Jesus' closest disciple, Peter. He's an eyewitness to both Jesus' closest disciple and his brother. So, I mean, I'm sorry, but again, I respect your disbelief, but if you want to go where the evidence goes, I think that atheists have done themselves a disservice by jumping on the bandwagon of mythicism, because, frankly, it makes you look foolish to the outside world. If that's what you're going to believe, you just look foolish. You are much better off going with historical evidence and arguing historically rather than coming up with the theory that Jesus didn't exist. So,
Well, again, let me get back out. So what I wanted you to do for us is, again, you referenced maybe not that particular video, but talked about the no true Scotsman fallacy. And Bart Ehrman was one of our guest authors earlier, not on the mythicism issue, on textual criticism. But anyway, could you take a moment and explain what that fallacy is and why you feel like he's committed the fallacy?
I can't remember where I connected no Scotsman with which part of Ehrman, but let me just respond to what he just said just now. I wrote the first part. Well, actually, I wrote Jesus Mything in Action in response to atheists who came up to me and said, "Oh, no, this is like, Holocaust denial. This is like moon landing denial." And if I had a nickel for every time somebody's equated it for creationism, actually, I would have made a lot of money in the early years, but in the last 7 years or so, I felt a real switch in more respectability. Talking about his book, Did Jesus Exist? Mythicists like me, and when I say myth like me, I mean the serious ones, not the crackpots who were doing the mushroom cult or the Romans invented it all. We didn't dislike that book because we thought he was going to agree with us. We disliked it because we were expecting the best defense of historicity, and he just phoned it in. And the things he mentions as a fact are all multiply questionable, and we do question them. And he acts as if all mythicists are alike, so he lumps us in with the mushroom people and the other guys.
Yeah, I think the part where you were talking about the no true Scotsman was when he was talking about no serious scholar of antiquities that works at a major university.
That's not true. We know.
Well, he qualified it though, and maybe I think that's the no true Scotsman.
You're right,
in other words,
there's
not
there's
just not credential, but that works at a university. So he qualified it and kind of
very carefully threads the needle on that. But you know what? Even that's not true. We know of ones who are in the closet about that, and they are terrified to voice their doubts because it's just like he's saying, they would look foolish to their colleagues. And again, I spend a whole chapter in the book just talking about that aspect of biblical studies, how, and again, not a conspiracy, it's just Christians being Christians, and wonderful folks like you and Daniel who are actually in the lion's den of atheism on the regular with your book club. My hat is off to you guys so much. I love that you are not afraid to put your money where your mouth is and have debates about why atheists are saying these crazy things. Why do they believe this, or such and such?
So the no true Scotsman is when somebody makes a generalization and says, like, no Christian would do blank. And well, here's 20 Christians who do. Well, no true Christian would do it. Exactly. And they try to qualify what they mean by Christian. Exactly. So there's scholars that hold to mythicism, but then he tries to say, well, no true scholars. That's I think that's what you were thinking.
I appreciate you pointing that out. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
But David, you also at the end of your book, you said that Christianity still could have happened just as it did without a real Jesus. And I think what you said was because, and this is a quote from your book, because a Jesus, even if such a figure existed, played no role in the formation of the movement that bears his name.
Yeah, and I'm not the one saying that. That's actually a quote from Kurt Noll and other scholars who we can accommodate. We can totally, what's the word? Take, what's the word I'm thinking of? I hate when I get stuck for a word. We can totally make sense of early Christianity with or without one. And I'm very excited about my book because I think you can say that about Judaism. I think you can say that about Islam. I think you can say that about all of them.
Well, as a former Mormon, I'm glad to know that at least we agree that Joseph Smith really existed.
Yes. And have you read my book on the Mormons? Because
I
think
have seen one of your videos.
Oh,
Bill Cluck told me about that. I watched
yeah, I did a
that,
whole
and
series with
I think we agree a lot on
Bryce. Like,
some of
I
the
think so
things
too.
on Mormonism.
In fact, I was thinking, if it gets really ugly here, we could just talk about the Mormons instead. Have a good time. But
The common-
Bryce Blankenagel from Naked Mormonism and I did a whole series on the early history of Mormonism that I think you'll love.
Yes.
We thought it was going to be like, a 6-7 part series. And I think we wrapped up at like 28, 29 and we never even made it to Utah. It just was, there was just so much to talk about.
David, are you familiar with the Book of Abraham and all that's history? I'm sure you
yeah.
are.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
Just I just this top of my head. I'm not trying to.
Yeah.
I just be real curious to see just your quick thoughts on like how I don't even see those in the same ballpark with the Gospels.
Oh,
do you
maybe,
see that?
Maybe
I mean,
not
what
the same ballpark. If I thought about it, maybe I could come up with an analogy. But yeah, the fact that he was able to take something, say this is what it means, and then we find the original, and every Egyptologist said no, this,
right.
He's completely wrong. That's one of the many smoking guns of Mormonism. That's like, why was it not finished right there? Boom.
Yeah. Are you saying, do you think something like that exists for Christianity, that there's a smoking gun, maybe it's gone, or that somebody would bring about a manuscript like Smith got in the 1830s and say, hey, look, this is what Christianity really was all about?
Well, I mean, honestly, it could go either way. I could see if we found some evidence, maybe there was a John the Baptist, maybe there was a Jesus. I could see that happening. It's less, I can't imagine a smoking gun that would say, oh, and I, Paul, have made up this religion and it's all bullshit. And, don't tell anyone. But, I don't see anything like that happening. For one reason, even if we had an original letter from Paul and he put in a safe and we just found it just now, we wouldn't know it's an original letter. We just say, oh, here's an interesting variant of this Pauline letter.
Third Corinthians is out there somewhere.
Exactly. Yeah. And the letter of tears and the letter to the Laodiceans, or was that a forgery? I can't remember now. But yeah, there's another thing I think we mentioned in our exchange is like, why is it in all of early Christianity, we only have basically one guy for the whole first 100 years or so up until Mark. We have forgeries in Peter's name. We have forgeries epistles, but everything is so Paul-ocentric. And I don't get the impression he was that big in the first century. It's weird that we have Book of Acts, but we don't have a real church history. We don't have, there's no paper trail. And you mentioned the Oxyrhynchus papyrus, and it's like, that's my whole point. It's like first of all, I mean, those are second century and later for starters.
Yeah, right.
I would love it if we had something from the first century that turned up in Oxyrhynchus that had something to say about early Christianity. That would be exciting to me. But again, it's like these were found in a trash heap. They didn't preserve those either. Why didn't they preserve what we would think of as scripture is an interesting question. But part of the answer to that, I think, is that up until the mid to early second century, whenever Marcion started his Apostolicon, that collection of scripture, nobody had an idea of, let's put together a collection of Christian writings. It just,
our theory has been kind of the opposite, that there was a unity, and until the heretic comes along to say, Paul didn't write that, or this is not true, then they said, well, we better actually put a preface on the Gospels, a anti-Marcion prologue or something, to let Marcion was wrong and this is why he was wrong. So, but then when there was a unity before, that wasn't necessary. But again, that's speculation on my part.
I just don't think there was a unity before. That's the thing. Yeah.
Well, let me do this. Believe it or not, our time is almost completely gone, and so let me see if I can pull up here quickly. If it'll let me do that. I just want to talk about next month very, very quickly. What's coming up? Is that even showing up?
And you're welcome to come back and join us next month, David.
Thank you.
Sit in the
I'd
galley
definitely
with us.
love to come when the new book is done.
So I was having trouble sharing my screen on my iPad, which is what I usually do. So I hope you guys can see, or we read around this pretty good. So anyway, next month, our guest author is going to be Gary Habermas. Let me tell you a little bit about Gary. Gary is a distinguished research professor of apologetics and philosophy at Liberty University. He earned his PhD from Michigan State University, MA from the University of Detroit, and a BRE from William Tyndale College. Dr. Habermas, who's been our guest at least, twice before, maybe, I think, a guest author, has dedicated his professional life to the examination of the relevant historical, philosophical, and theological issues surrounding the death and resurrection of Jesus. His extensive list of publications to date provide a thorough account of the current state of the issue. He has contributed more than 60 chapters or articles to additional books and over 100 articles and reviews in journals and other publications. In recent years, he's been a visiting or adjunct professor at about 15 different graduate schools and seminaries in the United States and abroad. We're going to be talking about his 2021 book, Risen Indeed, a historical investigation into the resurrection of Jesus, Lexham Press. It's a large book, 376 pages, not that expensive for the size of that work. And so what Brady and Bill and Daniel and I will do, we will try to get some focused chapters. So the whole book will be fair game, but we will have some particular chapters that we want to focus on. And Gary will be present with us by Zoom and taking your questions. Any questions about next month?
Oh, by the way, David, Gary says there's 15 independent attestations of Jesus.
He says a lot of things. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, we could use a. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Ken.
One point of overlap between Gary Habermas and David is you both have done some polling, apparently, of New Testament scholars to know where they stand on certain things. So Gary Habermas claims that, I don't know, what, 80% or some high percentage of New Testament scholars subscribe to these four basic facts about
minimal facts.
Minimal facts, yes. And what I appreciate about David also did some independent research into what New Testament scholars believe or what their doctrinal statements require them to. Yeah, I mean, so I'd be interesting to kind of, because I've always wondered, Gary has never, to my knowledge, published like where he got who he interviewed and like what tallied up the names of who believes what. I would like to see Gary give us a list, and I'd also like to see David give us a list of, who those scholars are, and so we understand better where those percentages come from that are being thrown out.
Gary told me his book's coming out in January, Ken.
Okay.
At least he's got 3 volumes, and it's his magnum opus. And we were in New Orleans this January, he said his editors threw it back at him to finish editing. But
yeah, because I've always been a little bit skeptical of Gary Habermas's claims about what percentage of scholars believe certain things, because I've never seen the numbers to back it up. Well, who are these people? It's just kind of.
I've only heard talks on it, and I don't remember. I mean, he will cite a reference here or there of a person, but I've never seen a list of the scholars. And I also wasn't clear. Has he personally talked with the scholars to ask them the same questions, or was he just reading their books and trying to extrapolate the information that way?
I'd be interested to know more about that. So that's why I found it fascinating that David also threw out some numbers and did some actual interviewing or scouring of websites to find out, different scholars' names and what they stood for.
David, it's been delightful. Thank you so much for being our guest author. And please don't wait until 5 years from now when we have you back on your next book. Come just stick your head in the door. That link will work. Any first Thursday is usually our nights to meet, first Thursday of the month. And thank you so much for being part of the Atheist and Christian Book Club. Any last minute advice for the atheists and for the Christians, or together, advice or suggestions for us?
Everybody love everybody. That's all I have to say. That's what I really love about this group is you guys are not afraid to get into hard, sticky questions. You're not afraid to disagree and not demonize each other. And that is why I love this group and groups like it. And I thank you very much for having me. I love to come back. I can't wait to come back.
Thanks so much, David. Our next club is August 3rd, and it will be at 7 o'clock Central Time, so 5 o'clock in California, and I guess 8 o'clock on the East Coast. Yeah. Did you have something for us, Daniel?
I was just going to say thanks again to David for his email exchanges, and I'm sure we'll be staying in touch. It's been a lot of fun chatting with you, Dave. Nice to meet you.
Absolutely.
And enjoyable. Glad to have you on, and I'm glad you like the club. And we get a lot more views after this posts on YouTube than we get participants live. Usually we get a lot more people watching this. So it's going to go up on YouTube in the next week or two.
Well, if there's more questions that I never got to, or him didn't hot about and need a more solid answer, let me know. I'd be happy to do a follow up.
Absolutely,
by email
absolutely.
or anything else. And yeah, by all means, I'm happy to share our email exchange if you are.
Sure, I am too.
Thanks a lot. Talk to you guys later. It's been
Good night,
fun.
all.
Good night.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, everybody.